and Tom and Len have since met, and I'm really excited to hear what you gentlemen are going to talk about.
I can't wait either. So, I read the book, loved it, called The Faithful Brain. Found a little bit of his background, so I contacted him. Now, that was a God wink. Just what, Bill didn't know him, he just said you need to meet him. It was a God wink. In my experience, 50% of the time, and Jackie, you're a God wink. We'll talk about that after a while. Most people don't do anything about it. Coincidence happen, you just say, oh, that's interesting. That's interesting, this guy, Dr. Matheson. And about 25% of the time, you'll follow up, and it doesn't really do much. And then the other 25% change your life forever. Jim Rohn changed my life forever in 1984 when one of my staff members, who I didn't realize at the time, had illegally taped Jim at an Amway meeting and brought the cassette tapes and put them on my desk. I said, Tom, you might enjoy these. It's just crazy. So that was a God wink. So we met at Picasso's coffee shop, I think,
Yep.
and really hit it off here in St. Charles. And then this guy said, well, I told him about Betty. Well, I'd like to meet your wife. Now here's a PhD, why would you want to meet my wife? Of course, don't you? Because she's so sweet. And so he brought his wife. He married up. There's another story there. So I'm going to ask him to answer some questions, but isn't it interesting when you meet somebody like Steve Spinner? I was playing golf with Kevin Hinton, and we were on a golf course in a golf cart, and Steve said, Kevin said, oh, there's Steve Spinner. And we went and said hi. Here we are. It had a big impact on our life. And one of the stories he told me, I think is interesting. He lived at one time on a sailboat in LA area, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So small, he couldn't even stand up. He had to get off the boat to be able to stand up. And the story that he's led. So, welcome. Glad you're here, Len.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah.
Good
We're going to see
here.
what we can do for Betty. Betty's is good in every way except her brain can't tell her legs what to do. She just has no strength in her legs. Her arms are fine, and all that. So anyhow, tell us a little bit, first of all, a little bit of your background, Len, where you grew up and all that.
Born in Los Angeles, California. Eldest of 6 kids from my folks, and then when I got to be about 17 years old, my folks started to take in foster kids. So I tell people I'm the eldest of 21 altogether. And a smart kid, had a probably too much smart for my own good, and got married at 19. I turned out to get married and divorced 3 times before I turned 30, and got involved with drugs and alcohol, sex, rock and roll, things like that in Southern California. Also, though, was an entrepreneur from probably age 9 or so, and realized that I was a person that I think I now call a lifelong learner, always very curious about things. And God was watching over me back when I wasn't paying attention to God and didn't want to have God take a look at my crummy life. He got me a job working in a hospital at a very low level with a young man named Danny Monday. Danny was 14 years old and had a disease called spinal muscular atrophy. Met him the first couple of minutes. I came into this job in February 1970. And Danny changed my life. He was a young man that he knew he was in a terminal phase of life. Most kids don't live beyond, back in those days, don't live beyond 15 years old, and he was 14. He was a believer. He was a Christian, and not just a believer, but he was a Christ follower. And I wasn't. I had been raised in a Christian home, pushed God away about 19, 20, actually probably age 21. Don't want to have anything more to do with God. And over the next several years was really on the outs with God, but Danny was the first person that God sent to me to start reeling me back in. And at that point, I became a real, first a hobbyist about the brain, and then eventually a professional about the brain, and went on and I'd flunked out of school I got back into school, got bachelor's, a couple of master's degrees, a PhD in neuroscience back when there wasn't yet neuroscience, studying the brain. And gone on since then. Got married. I've been married now 36 years. 2 wonderful kids, 2 great grandkids.
So can we talk about how you met Mary?
Yeah, well,
Nancy, you had a great friend. I've quoted you so many times. I said something to Nancy one time. I said, God works in mysterious ways. And she said, stop it, Tom. Just say God works.
yeah, that's right.
So he went to, anybody ever familiar with Landmark Forum, the seminar program called Landmark Forum? And it used to be EST, Earhart's seminar training, and Warner Earhart, who was a character.
He really was.
A really interesting guy. Got in trouble and with the IRS, I think, at one point. But anyhow, it was a famous confrontational kind of a program. So you went to one of the EST.
Yeah, I was divorced for the 3rd time. A friend of mine took me to an introductory meeting, and there was a young woman sitting, there were about 400 people, and there were 300 or 400 people, young woman sitting 3 or 4 rows ahead of me that I think I've seen you before. And I think she saw me, and she was trying to get away from me getting out of the room. And I came up to her and tapped her on the shoulder, and I don't remember your name. Well, that's Mary. And she was there. Her husband was in his terminal phase of life, just had a couple of weeks to live, actually, due to ALS. And she was a new mom. She had some health problems herself, and here her husband was dying on her. So she was in just a terrible place in her life, and wanted to kind of put things back together as best she could, and wanted to do it without having to know anybody or anybody know about it. And I was in the same place, and it turned out that I was living on a little 27-foot sailboat about a mile from where she lived, and this seminar, which was going to go on for several weeks, was taking place about 35 miles from where we were both living. So we shared a ride back and forth, and in that time we became friends. And over the next several months, I was with her as her husband died, and then I went to her and I said, a few months later, I said, I'd be interested. We've been friends, and I really enjoy your company. You've got a lot of integrity. Would you be interested in actually going out on a date? He says, well, I know your background. You've been married and divorced 3 times. I've got a little girl here. She had a little 4-year-old daughter. So I wouldn't be interested in a relationship with a man who doesn't have any faith. She knew about my handoff to God. And I said, well, how do I do that? She says, well, why don't you come to church with me? And so our first date was at the Huntington Beach Community United Methodist Church. And at that sermon, a guy named Dick Burdine was preaching. He was about 3 inches shorter than you and weighed about 30 pounds less than you. Little guy. But he had about 300 or 400 people in the audience, and he said, he was preaching from John chapter 1 in the Bible. He said, now, Moses brought the law. Jesus brought grace and truth. Do you know why grace comes before truth? And I don't know. And nobody in the audience knew, of course. And he grabs his lectern and stands up on his tiptoes and yells out, because without grace you can't stand the truth. And it went boom like that. He was talking right to me. I'd spent the last many years just as a miserable, in some ways I was successful financially, I was, but in other ways I was just a real mess. And I started to cry. And over the next probably year and a half, I started to pay attention to Mary, who was a Christ follower, and Dick Burdine, who became our pastor, and he wound up marrying us a couple of years later. And Mary stayed patient with me. I was a scientist, I was a skeptic. First I was a cynic, then I was a skeptic. And it took me several years, and then finally, August 3, 1995, I said, Jesus, I'm yours. Crossed the line of faith and have done my best to be a Christ follower since then, and come to today where I'm trying to bridge between the science that I've been trained in and the faith that I trust, and to try to bridge what I see as an unnecessary social political gap between the academic scientist community, the educated faith community.
So
And that's why I wrote the book.
So speaking of Mary, you mean one person who's attracted to you because who you become can change your life forever?
Oh my goodness.
Mary's one of those, when you meet her, you just say, she's got it. You just know. She's so special, not dramatic in any way, just got it. It's amazing. Maybe like Corey, Steve. We're going to tell that story in a little bit. So what are you currently doing now professionally?
Well, I just retired from Covenant Theological Seminary, where I've been on the faculty there teaching in the master's program. I was at WashU for 15 years. That's what brought Mary and I and our kids out to the Midwest. And retired from WashU and then took a job at Covenant Seminary and just retired. I'm just wrapping up my final grades right now. And retirement is something I don't believe in, so I have to retire serially. What I'm doing is in some ways following in your footsteps, Tom. I'm doing my best to take care of my brain. And I recognize what I need to do to take care of my brain, and that's basically to be an entrepreneur. Been an entrepreneur since I was a little kid, and I'm entrepreneuring now into an entity called the Faithful Brain Institute. And I've got two partners, Mark Dungan and Tony Rusing, and we work to help bridge that gap. We're working on that together.
So tell us a little about that. So ideally, what would happen as a result of the Brain Institute?
Well, I think everybody would take would assume that people who are strong Christians assume that the Bible is correct, but we don't take it the full way. We stop with a pretty limited interpretation of the Bible. Paul in Romans 12:2 said, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." And I take that as the literal truth, and then I've gone and in the book I've talked about what the neuroscience is behind what Paul was teaching 2,100 years ago. Jesus said, love God, love your neighbor as yourself. Those are the two basic commandments. Everything else doesn't count once you do those. And I've put the neuroscience into that. The truth of that is really pertinent today. And so what I'd like to do is to have not just America, but all of everybody on the planet to realize that if we do follow those guidelines, we can live to be 120 years old, we can minimize the likelihood of lots of disease processes, cancers and dementias. We can really have the lives that our brains and bodies were designed to have.
So when did you write, what motivated you to write the book? Just to tell the story, get the message out?
Yeah, I knew that I needed to, I had taken the job at WashU in order to continue my entrepreneuring. I was doing really well in Southern California. Mary and I had put together a nice life there, a really strong business, but I had wanted to be a member of an elite medical school faculty since I was a young man, and I got a job offer to come back here, and I told them no for 3 years, and they kept coming back to me and saying, we'll have you, we really like to have you. So I finally said, okay. I took a 60% pay cut to come back, and yet it turned out to be a bargain, because I was able to work with the world leader on brain research. There's no place in the world that's stronger on brain research than WashU. And I learned a lot, made a lot of good friends, and I brought to it my faith, and so there was kind of a mismatch there. And so as soon as I could retire from WashU, I did, because I wanted to get out and have more time and space to tell the story of the neuroscience and the faith together. And so I spent the next 5.5 years writing the book, and threw away about 85% of what I wrote. I kept handing drafts to Mary, and she'd say, nope, nope, nope.
A good wife. A good critic.
She was a great critic. And also Mark Dungan and Tony Rusing were involved with me, helping to write the book. And and telling me, you know, you got to talk so that other people can understand it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've got, the book has about 400 scientific references in it, but it's also written so that a 10th grader could read it. And by the way, I hope eventually to get the book into high schools so that Christian kids, as they leave high school and go on to college, can take their faith with them and really stand on their own 2 feet in their science classes in college so that their faith can change those science classes. And actually, right now the Christian church throughout America is losing 20-somethings at an alarming rate. And one of the things I'd like to do is turn that around based upon the reason, the rationale, the rationality, the science that the Bible points us to.
Mm-hmm. So would you agree with Doc that everybody should write a book?
Absolutely. I think everybody's got a book, and it's a great lesson.
Is Jay Peters still here? Just want to make sure. You got to get that book written, Jay.
That's right.
So Len, Dr. Matheson, has given us a copy of his book to give to Betty's therapist. See where that goes. You know, just we follow the thread. And so God's been winking, and because of Bill Ellis making a connection, it's going to have a big impact. And hopefully he'll be at the summit in October in Memphis, Tennessee, at the famous Peabody Hotel. Let's hear it for Dr. Matheson. God bless you.
Thank you, Tony.
God bless you.
Oh, thanks.